Craig later said he would be coming, but will be a little late.
Whenever you guys want to get ready to get started, we can, but take your time.
Okay. We'll give it till 6:35.
You want to go ahead and put your slideshow up?
Yes, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. 6:35. Let's get started. Thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. This is the meeting of the Task Force for Residential Rezoning, Community Board 8, joined this evening by my co-chair, Adam Wald. I am Elizabeth Rose, and thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Our agenda tonight is a summary agenda. This is a summary of the discussions that this task force has held over the course of the past year for all of the blocks in Community Board 8. that are currently zoned for manufacturing or commercial use, and specifically where a new residential use is not permitted under current zoning. Then old business and new business. But I think this is it's a pretty meaty conversation. Within that first agenda items, we're going to go through a number of different topics. The purpose of the task force, the activity that we've undertaken over the past year. We have developed some guidelines for how we have thought about what an appropriate zone might be for these various blocks. We'll talk about the zone types themselves, and then we will go through the block by block recommendations. And then finally, we'll end with next steps. So with apologies for those who have been attending these meetings, there are some new names. So we are reviewing a bunch of the information that some people may be very familiar with. This task force was created a little over a year ago by then board chair Russell Squires in a response to the board resolution. And the board resolution really came about when a mid-block site got developed with a 160 some odd foot storage facility. And people were, I think, frankly, reasonably upset that if you're going to have a 164-foot building on a mid-block in the Upper East Side, we would have much rather have seen that be a residential building rather than a storage facility. The goal of the task force is to help address the need for more affordable housing in Community Board 8 by proposing zoning actions that would trigger mandatory inclusionary housing, meaning housing that requires affordable units on 20% or more of the square footage of that building. City of Yes that just passed has no mandatory inclusionary and housing involved. It creates the option for affordable housing by a developer, but it is not required. You can still build as of right anywhere on the Upper East Side without affordable housing. And it is one of the concerns that the board has today that so much of the development on the Upper East Side is as of right, does not include affordable housing. And this task force is solely focused on the blocks that either are zoned C84 or M14. These are blocks, and in many cases, they are portions of blocks. They're not the full entire block, but they are typically the mid-block section of the block. These are blocks where new residential use is not allowed. And I'm very specific about that word use. It's not, you can't even take an existing building and convert it from office space to residential. That's not currently allowed. Much less the ability to take down a building and build a brand new residential building. Neither of those changes are permitted currently. And throughout this process, as we have had these meetings, there has been general agreement that not permitting new residential use on any of these blocks is a somewhat out of date type of zoning for this community. So Adam, why don't you take from here?
Sure. Thank you, and thank you all for joining. So where are C84 and M1 zoning districts in Community Board 8? So they're concentrated in some of the easterly blocks in the 90s. There's some M14 zones in the 70s, and then there's some C84 zones down in the 60s. These are all generally east of 3rd Avenue. And we're going to go through each of the areas later in this meeting, but you can see where everything is concentrated east of 3rd, closer to the river, and in areas that have, that have been surrounded by historically some more intense commercial or manufacturing uses. Next slide. So M14 allows for 2.0 FAR or floor area ratio. of manufacturing use and up to 6.5 FAR for certain community facility uses. The C8-4 allows for 5.0 for commercial and 6.5 for community facility, and similar use groups that promote development of commercial office, schools, life science, self-storage, certain manufacturing uses. And you can also build warehouses, auto repair, parking garages, but most importantly, residential uses are not permitted. And additionally, it's important to note that there is no stated height limit in M14 or C8-4, as Elizabeth alluded to. On a mid-block site, you can build a 160-foot tall self-storage building. Next slide. So the activities of the task force have been held over 7 public meetings. Tonight is the 8th. During our meetings, we have met with members or representatives from the Department of City Planning. We met with representatives Department of Parks and Recreation. And then we reviewed all the existing zoning types for the C8-4 and the M14, as well as residential zoning types that'd be appropriate to be mapped in these zoning districts. And that helped us develop the guidelines for our zoning proposals. And we went through and we documented block by block the existing conditions, including the number of housing units and rent stabilization status of each of the parcels in the areas that are under study. And we reviewed block by block photographs, which, we went and visited every parcel. And then we went through and we recommended and facilitated discussion about the new zone proposal for each block over the course of the 7 meetings. Next slide. So in our work, what we developed was guidelines and rationale for how we're going to approach this. Our first guideline was FAR equal to or greater than 6.5. We're going to asterisk that. Actually, there's a caveat to that one, which we will get to a little later. And the reason for that was we wanted that to be either equal to, we want that equal to the existing FAR available for community facility under the M14 and the C8-4. So the next guideline we had was an FAR to ensure all or almost all lots meet MIH. This is the reason for this task force, is to not only promote housing, but the idea is to promote mixed income housing that includes affordable units. And we wanted to minimize the potential for parcels to be developed with new housing that did not include on-site affordable units. The next guideline was to minimize incentives to redevelop existing housing, especially rent stabilized housing. So that ties into what we're going to get to later. We think it's important to preserve the existing affordable stock where it exists. We also looked at using contextual zones where available. We don't want 400-foot tall buildings in the mid-block. We don't think that that's appropriate. And the only approach was to create a height limit using contextual zones. And another guideline was to mirror the adjacent and opposite block zone types, especially along the avenue. So we wanted the new framework that when we're converting an M14 or C8-4 to a residential district to have some consistency with what's across the street, diagonal, in the immediate vicinity of the zone that we're tackling at that moment. And we want to encourage paired or mixed use districts because there are existing uses that may be appropriate and they should be grandfathered in. And we think it's consistent with rezoning of other manufacturing districts, like what was done in Soho, NoHo. This
This is the next slide.
Right. Okay. So there are 4 main zoning types that we looked. In our discussions with DCP, they had recommended that we consider essentially off the shelf for existing zoning districts. Again, this is all the zoning districts we chose existed prior to the establishment of City of Yes for housing opportunity. And so the main zoning districts we looked at are R8B, R8A, R10A equivalents, or R10 equivalent. The main difference between R8A and R8B is the FARs of 4 versus 6, which also can be increased to 4.8 now under City of Yes, or under 7.2 under City of Yes for R8A. And the difference between R10A and R10 is contextual zoning districts with stated height caps versus tower on base or uncapped development heights. And this chart shows, where these exist in the neighborhood, the primary uses, the pros of these zoning districts, as well as the cons for each of the zoning districts. So we can go through each of them, or these were used to inform our eventual zoning types that we introduced at each meeting, and that was voted on by the people who attended the meeting.
I would add R8A is probably the single most common of the zone types in our recommendations. It is the closest in terms of its FAR to what is currently allowed in these locations if they were to be used for community facility use. In some ways, I think it's an in-between. It is a little bit bigger than R8B. It is not as big as R9 or R10 or R9A or R10A. And so it will, we hope, meet the needs of both what we're trying to achieve in terms of housing and affordable housing, but still retain the height differential on a mid-block, making it lower than what's happening on the avenues, and in that way continue what we have largely throughout the Upper East Side. And just one point on R8B here, the big concern, in addition to R8B being a down zoning versus what is currently allowed on these lots, the biggest concern with R8B is that if the lot is less than 51 feet 7 inches wide, that lot will not require mandatory inclusionary housing if it is redeveloped. And a 50-foot lot is a very, very large lot. So anything smaller than 50 feet, and most lots would not require mandatory inclusionary housing under R8B.
So here are images of the zone types that we referenced. On the left is R8B on East 82nd Street. If you walk by it, you know it's a newer development. R8A, there's actually not a lot of new R8A buildings in the Upper East Side because the zoning type doesn't really exist. But this is an example of a development on West 120th Street. The next one is an R10A equivalent. So this is, the Brompton at 205 East 85th Street, which is built in, it's a C28A zoning district, but it's an R10A residential equivalent. And then the last one is an R10 equivalent. It's a C19 zoning district. That's the Carmel's new rental development on the corner of 78th Street and First Avenue. So it shows you the scale of R8B all the way up to R10 in our neighborhood. Next slide. So here are other examples of R8A equivalent developments around the city. So on the left you have R9A. It's a similar height, and 125 feet up to 145 feet is the maximum height. The next one over is an R8A residential equivalent. I believe it's to 11 stories and 120 feet. And the one on the right it's mapped in an R8B, but it was developed under the old R8 zoning district before R8 was downzoned to R8B. And that building is built effectively to an FAR of 7.4, which is nearly identical to the 7.2 FAR in the R8A that we are encouraging in a lot of the rezoned areas that we investigated for this task force. Next slide. And here's some examples of Upper East Side mid-block buildings that exceed the R8A density of 7.2. So on the left, you have 225 East 63rd Street. It was an old R8, and it's built to an effective FAR of 8.4. Next to it, we have a building that's in our study area. It's actually a 12-story building on East 90th Street with an effective FAR of 7.2. And then lastly, we have a building that was on East 73rd Street that again is a mid-block, and it's on a narrow street, and it's a 13-story building with an effective FAR of 8.7. So these are examples of larger buildings in the mid-block on narrow streets in the Upper East Side.
And I think, I just add, these buildings are not rare. They're not black swans. They exist in lots of blocks, in lots of places on the Upper East Side, particularly on the Eastern Avenues. And they also exist where both sides of the street are at this same height. So that is also not unheard of already in our community. So with those as examples, we would like to jump into the actual block by block recommendations that were developed, presented, and then discussed at the prior meetings. I want to just note that, so in this summary, we'll discuss the individual block, what street it is, what was the zoning type that was proposed in the meeting. There may be a modified proposal that we are discussing tonight. Sometimes that modification was actively discussed in the meeting, and in a couple of cases, it's a modification that we are raising tonight based on the discussion from the meetings themselves, and if there's any explanatory information that we want to add. Unless it's particularly called out by either a modified proposal or mentioned in the comments, the people who were attending the meeting for each of these individual blocks were generally in agreement with the zone type that was proposed in the meeting. And as Adam mentioned earlier, we did do straw polls of anybody who attended the meeting, not just board members, but members of the public as well. And you'll see some of the reactions in some of the areas where those straw polls may have differed from the initial recommendation. So the first block, and these are now in somewhat a numerical order of the upper part of the district, block 1556 is the block of 94th Street between 1st and 2nd Avenues. And in the meeting, we proposed R8A, and this was generally accepted as a proposal. The next block, so this would have been the south side of 94th Street between 1st and 2nd Avenues. The next block is 1557, so that's the north block of 94th Street and the south side of 95th Street between 1st and 2nd Avenues. And here we felt a larger potential building was appropriate, and we proposed R10A. And again, there was general acceptance of that zone type in the meeting. Block 1569, 90th Street between 1st and York. Again, this is the south side of a block. We proposed R8A. And then opposite that, block 1570, which is the south side of 91st Street and the north side of south side of 90th Street and the north side of 91st Street between 1st and York. We also proposed R8A. During the course of the meeting, there was general discussion and agreement that along 90th Street, the north side of 90th Street, that block should be changed to R8B. And the reason was that that block is entirely currently residential. Every single lot on that block was already residential. Not all of it rent stabilized, but all of it residential, and it was described as a very stable residential block. And so the modified proposal for the north side of 90th Street is R8B, and on the south side of 91st Street remaining R8A. Block 1571 is the north side of 91st Street, south side of 92nd Street, between First and York Avenues. And there we also proposed R8A. In this case, the meeting attendees expressed a preference for R8B, and this is now just on the 91st Street side. Sorry, let me clarify that. We have two different proposals here. On 91st Street, we recommended R8A. The attendees in the meeting expressed a preference for R8B during the meeting. Subsequent to the meeting, we reviewed the actual lots that are on that block and what is currently there. Of the 5 lots that are covered by whatever we would do on this block, only one is an existing multifamily residential location. It is a co-op. Of the remaining lots, 3 of the 4 other lots are sufficiently narrow that they would not require MIH if they were to be developed under R8B. So because of those 2 things, we are continuing with the recommendation for R8A in this location. The north side of 92nd Street, we proposed in the meeting R10A. This is a block that is opposite NYCHA housing. So it has a wide street effect. The NYCHA housing is both set back from the sidewalk and it is placed in effectively a, open park-like setting. And those buildings are already in the 235-foot range, which is what the maximum height of an R10A building would be. So they'd be very similar in terms of height. Attendees at this meeting were evenly split on this recommendation. Literally, it was right down the middle. 50% agreed, 50% were less comfortable with R10A, would have preferred something else. Finally, in this area, block 1587, which is 90th Street between York and the river, this is the asphalt green block. And in particular, we had brought in a representative from the Department of Parks and Recreation to discuss the potential to designate this block as parkland in an effort to preserve both existing use and open space. We were advised that if those were our objectives for this particular block, that the best action is no action and to simply leave the existing zoning as it is for this location. We now go down to the East 60s and 70s. Block 1435, very complex block. This is the block that is bisected by the exit ramp from the Koch Bridge. The south side of this block on 60th Street abuts to the 59th Street Bridge. Then there is a section along First Avenue, and then a section on 61st Street, which is the block that is bisected by the off-ramp. So we've broken this into 3 separate recommendations. Along First Avenue, and this is now the west side of First Avenue between 60th and 61st Street, we recommended an R10 equivalent with a commercial overlay, for example, a C19 or a C28. And this is consistent with the zoning immediately opposite, north, and diagonal for this avenue location. On the north side of 60th Street, which overlooks the bridge itself, here we are proposing R10. Simple residential, but not contextual. We think that the bridge itself creates a wide street effect that makes this much more equivalent to a residential avenue location. Finally, on the 61st Street side, this is a case where we actually recommended R8B for this portion of the block. And in the meeting, the attendees expressed that they felt that this block could accommodate greater density. And so from that conversation, we are modifying the proposal here for R8A. The next block we looked at, block 1456, is 61st to 62nd Street between First Avenue and York Avenues. And again, this has an avenue component as well as a mid-block component. So I'm going to do the avenue component first, which is this line here, where again, we would propose an R10 with a commercial overlay consistent with First Avenue zoning, both south of this and north of this. And of course, consistent with the recommendation to make the block on between 60th and 61st also R10 with commercial overlay. We're creating consistency. For the mid-block portions, 61st and 62nd, this is now the north side of 61st, the south side of 62nd between First and York. Here we're proposing R8A. Many of the buildings on this block are already developed to a height that is at least very consistent with the R8A zone. Moving on towards York Avenue, block 1474, 61st to 62nd, between York and the river. This includes an avenue location on the west side, on the east side of the block, and this is also the site of the Bentley Hotel and the Animal Medical Center. In the meeting, we discussed an R10 equivalent. We were not specific, and the meeting did not get to a specific answer on a commercial overlay or without a commercial overlay, or with a height limit or without a height limit. Subsequent to the meeting, as Adam and I have been reviewing these and trying to get a sense of make sure that we are being consistent, we are proposing here that this be R10, and that doing so, in the event that the block were to be redeveloped or the Bentley Hotel were to be redeveloped, it would allow the Animal Medical Center to benefit from the rezoning through a potential sale of air rights. R10A would not likely provide any benefit to the Animal Medical Center here. Okay, now we go to the East 70s. So we start on the south side of 73rd Street between York and the river. Here we recommended R10, and this is a location where many of the lots are actually through lots to 72nd Street. All but one of the lots are already also mapped R10 in addition to being mapped I guess it was the C8-4 that was there. And most of them, if not all, I think all but one of them are already built to the maximum FAR or are in fact overbuilt. The next block is the opposite block. So the north side of 73rd Street and the south side of 74th Street between York Avenue and the river. Here we again recommended R10. And there was a great deal of discussion in the room in that meeting. In that meeting, the attendees specifically preferred R10A on 74th Street. And so that is the modified proposal there. And also in reviewing what has been done across all of the geographies, we are also modifying the proposal for the 73rd Street side to R8B. And in that case, 4 of the 6 lots that would be affected are already residential and are rent stabilized. So in the trade-off of protecting versus encouraging, in this case, there's enough there to protect. The next block up is 74th to 75th between York and the river. This is the Con Ed site. Technically, it's an M3-2, so it's not technically in our scope, but we're including it here just so everybody can kind of follow along as we work our way up in the 70s. And obviously, if for any reason Con Ed ever withdraws from this site, this is a potential opportunity, and whether that is for significant residential or for open space and a park, we can leave that for future task forces to determine. And finally, and I think this is the last block, 75th to 76th between York and the river. So this is now the south side of 75th Street, the north side of 76th Street. We recommended R10A along 75th, which is looking south over the Con Ed site, and R8A along 76th, looking north over John Jay Park. And by having the lower height immediately opposite John Jay Park, we are preserving the light and air going to the park. So I know that is a lot. And at this point, we'd like to stop and open this up for questions, for comments. And we would like to start with members of the public.
So if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, you should look for the React icon on your device and press that to open up the menu to look for the raise hand button. You have a hand up from Judy, but that's the only one so far.
Okay, Judy.
Terrific presentation, well put together, easy to read. I have, I call it a point of information. I think what's missing in certain spots, you had it in one spot in the 70s, is you need, when you do the write-up, to be specific north side, south side. When you're talking about 90th Street, north side, south side, in your little chart.
Okay.
Because otherwise people don't understand it. Okay, I know it's a lot maybe to squeeze in. Maybe you can do abbreviations. I don't know how. But I think that's really important to understand what specific block you're talking about. But
Okay.
otherwise, I thought it was very good.
It's a great suggestion. Thank you, Judy. Lo Vandervalk?
Yes, Lo Vandervalk, representing Carnegie Hill Neighbors. I support what Judy just said, and I think it can be the distinction between north and south. And I think the letter S and the letter N in front of the street could be a compressed way of presenting this. Otherwise, I think this is an outstanding presentation. If possible, it would be really great if we could have maps, but I know that would make it voluminous, but maps always do help.
So, Lo, we do in fact have, and we will post an appendix. Yes, it makes
Well,
it
wait,
incredibly voluminous, and it will include a map of each block showing the lots, showing what's residential, what's not residential. We included all of those in each individual meeting as we discussed each block, and it also includes the photographs of the buildings on the block, the buildings across the street, the buildings diagonal, so that basically the materials that we presented in each of these individual meetings as we discussed each block on a one by one basis.
It's not too bad.
Okay.
It's only 80 slides.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Does anybody else have questions or comments? All right, Sebastian.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and also thanks, Adam. I appreciate the presentation as always. Question that I have is, what options might we have if we were trying to make this a little more ambitious and try to create a few additional homes in our neighborhood? Just to sort of test that idea, what could we do?
Okay, I'm going to speak hypothetically. Anywhere that is currently proposed for R8, to be more ambitious, you could go up to an R9, you could go up to an R10. Basically, there are zones that exist or zone types that exist sort of in step units of one FAR. So if in this case, R8A is 6 to 7.2 or 7.2 with mandatory inclusionary housing. I don't think there is anything that is 8, but there is something that is 9. R10 with inclusionary housing is 12. So that is a way that one could stepwise be more ambitious. And George, you have your hand up next. You might also, with whatever you would like to ask or say, address that same question.
Thank you,
Sure.
Elizabeth.
I raised my hand because in some other work I had seen that the peaker plant, the Con Ed peaker plant, they had stated their intention to close that. It only had operated a few days a year, and they had started some regulatory process to close that plant. So you may want to rethink that
Okay.
unless their plans have changed. This was a couple of years ago. Um, but yeah, I mean, essentially to answer the question that Bastian asked, is that if you were to, clearly if to create more housing, you would do an R9. I would also suggest there's something called an R9X, which is the X envelope is a little bit looser. It allows for contextual zoning, but allows for more zoning lot mergers with it, which can be good if you have a kind of mixed block. I would also say that one of the things that was interesting to me, and I'm wondering if you had feedback from the Department of City Planning on this, is they don't typically, and this may be changing because typically is no longer, they're changing the way they do business, but typically the way they had been doing business is if you're going from M to something that allows for residential, or even the C8s, they would like to go to a C, like a C62 or a C44D, which are commercial districts that allow for residential. Um, that way, the existing uses wouldn't necessarily be grandfathered; they'd be allowed. And they typically, when they do something like this, they like doing that. And I was wondering if you ever had a conversation with them about going from M to R without getting into the commercial equivalent.
So we have not spoken to them about that specifically.
Okay.
What they have said is they would like to see a preliminary application statement
Hmm.
that defines our goals and our rationale and basically lays out what we're trying to accomplish, at which point they would happily give us feedback on the proposal, and more specifically, would suggest alternate zone types that they feel might better meet the objectives.
Got it.
So I would take your suggestion of maybe it's going to a C type zone as opposed to an R type zone as the kind of thing that they might suggest.
Got it.
You know, neither Adam and I mean, Adam more than I, but this is not our,
Yeah.
our professional expertise. And I think as we were defining these zone types, we were trying to keep it simple, and use types that we understood, and that basically each of these zone types sort of has some core definition pieces to it. The allowable FAR, the height limit, the setbacks, the street wall height, those are all things that we can understand. And if there is a commercial equivalent that gets you sort of to that same place,
Right.
that might make more sense.
Got it.
But we at least wanted to kind of define the envelopes, as it were, as
Got it.
opposed to, know the ins and outs of every variation on the zones. At one point, I was sort of thinking to myself, well, what's the difference between a 7X and a 7D? And I realized I just don't have that level of nuance.
Right. But just to close the loop on what Sebastian was saying is that typically, on the Upper East Side, we have high density on the avenues, lower density in the mid blocks, right? And what you've designed is this kind of R10 on the avenues, R8 in the mid blocks. It's consistent with the pattern. It's consistent with the pattern of development that we've seen on the Upper East Side, which goes back to the 1916 zoning resolution, which, it's effectively determined the height of the building by the width of the street on which it faces. So there's a lot of logic in what you've done. It's the first time I've really looked at it, and thank you for the invitation to come here today. And I think, this sort of thing is the kind of thing I think would be favorably received at the Department of City Planning.
Thank you, George. Craig Lader? The Walking Man.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I apologize for walking. I'll be in my apartment in a minute, but in the meantime, I'd like to pose a resolution and if seconded, speak to it. And that resolution is that Community Board 8 supports the recommendations of the Residential Zoning Task Force and will begin the process of developing an application with city planning, and then maybe you can help me with this, in which we'll be seeking their feedback on how to refine it to generate additional housing within this context of what we've recommended. I know that's not perfect. I didn't have a chance to write it down because I was on the bus, but hopefully we could refine that. But in the meantime, I just want to thank you, Elizabeth and Adam. I think you have done yeoman's work on this whole process and getting us to this point. We have done a tremendous amount of work as a task force. We've had many meetings, we've had extensive discussions, and I think we are ready to move forward with this.
Thank you. All right, I think I saw a thumbs up from Sharon Pope Marshall as a second. And certainly Judy is on camera.
Oh, sorry.
Seconding. No, you're fine, Craig. We see you going up the elevator. So we have a number of seconds.
Okay, great. So I don't know if you're able to hear if I cut out, but I think
go ahead. You are free to
we've
go
seen
ahead
from
and
the
speak
onset
to
of
the
this,
resolution, Craig.
All right, excellent. As we've discussed, I think we all have come to the conclusion that we have a real need to be able to generate housing, and it's a real shame that it took a self-storage facility to recognize that we had this opportunity. But now that we have it, I think we have done the work necessary to be able to bring us to the next phase. I'll leave it at that for now.
That's great. Thank you. Do we have any buddy who would like to speak? Any comments? Michelle.
I seem to have some new icons on the bottom of my screen. Sometimes programs adjust themselves. I couldn't find my raised hand. Anyway, I would not quite comfortable with that resolution with the addition at the end that asks city planning to this is probably not, this is paraphrasing, obviously, but the intent is basically with an eye towards creating more housing than is proposed. And the reason I say that is it's without, there should be a qualifier without changing the character of the neighborhood and continuing to respect the continuity of the surrounding area. Because when I look at the rezoning, yes, it's a laudable goal and it's all our goals to get more housing, but there has to be a balance about what you're willing to give up. And the conversations reflected that balance as we went through them this past year. Because as you did, you showed pictures of what was opposite. You know, we tried to make it contextual. So the blanket statement enshrined in this resolution to offer suggestions to create more housing without the additional phrase, without breaching the contextual nature of our suggestions or breaching the existing characters of the neighborhood, some kind of wording like that. Or the best thing to my mind would be to leave that sentence off the resolution. That's my friendly suggestion. I don't know if Craig is willing to do that, but without an additional characterization, I couldn't support that.
Craig, is it okay with you if I jump in for a second?
Well, please do.
I think, Michelle, as I heard and interpreted the resolution is to support the development, to support the work and the recommendations of the task force, to support the development of a pre-application statement, which would go to city planning, and then for city planning to engage, hope that city planning would engage with us and give us feedback on that pre-application statement. I don't think Craig was asking city planning to specifically give us recommendations of how we could get even more housing above and beyond what we are proposing.
Well,
I didn't interpret
maybe you're
it.
right. Only Craig can clarify
Yeah.
that. But the word, and he will, I'm sure, but the words that I heard were in essence and give us suggestions on how we can create more housing. If I didn't hear that correctly, or if Craig wants to clarify, he's the best judge of what he said.
Yes. No, Elizabeth is correct. And I did not, as I said, have this written down, so I did not have the chance to really be able to have tight language in there. So that's why I was sort of thinking out loud as I was putting that resolution together in my mind. So Elizabeth,
So there is no qualifier in your resolution.
It doesn't need to be a qualifier. I think I was trying to take the spirit of what George was saying, in that city planning will and city planning may have recommendations for us as to how we may be able to achieve more within the context of what we are recommending here. So it's not intended to do anything that's drastically different from what we've already recommended. It's using the expertise of city planning to be able to provide us with that necessary expertise and feedback that may be able to improve upon this in their response to our pre-application. But if we don't need that, we don't need that.
Yeah, I don't think we need it, because I think city planning, that's naturally what they will do. That's why they ask for the pre-application. They often meet, they want to know what the intent is, and their job, they will give feedback. I just don't want to direct their feedback. let them give us feedback, but I don't want anything, from my point of view, I don't want anything in the resolution that directs their feedback.
Well, I still would like to have something that says that we are interested in maximizing housing opportunities based off of the work that we have done and the recommendations that we have made.
Yes,
If that
okay.
makes
Well, that's
sense.
what I thought I heard you say, Craig. So what I'm saying is I'm not comfortable with that unless there's a qualifier on that
Okay,
that's, you know, that says within the, you know, the context and however you know, the context of the existing zoning and the preservation of the character of the neighborhood. So I thought I heard you say that. And that's the sentence I would either like eliminated, because we can definitely do that as we have ongoing conversations with them. And they may themselves suggest that without us directing them. But if we're going to direct them, I would like a qualifier on there that says within the context and appropriateness of the sense of community of the existing, you know, however we want to put it together. I'm
Yeah.
thinking out loud also.
Yes.
So if you're willing to do that, and then we can examine the wording, that would be fine with me. But without either eliminating that sentence or creating a qualifier, I don't think I could support that.
All right. I'm trying to figure out the best. I appreciate your feedback, and I'm hoping we can get a unanimous resolution. I don't feel comfortable with the language you're proposing because I think that could take us down a different path, and people are prone to then perhaps want to contest it on and suggest that our recommendations perhaps may already be doing that because they could view a single development as changing a character of a block, or and in essence extend that. So I don't feel comfortable with that language. So let me give this some thought if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay, we've
Thank
got
you.
other people who want to speak, so let's call on some other people, and Craig, perhaps we can come back to and hammer out some specific language. Barbara Rutter.
First of all, thank you. This was brilliant, the both of you, and Will helped or whatever. Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions, if you will bear me. One is, if you have a height limit, so FAR in effect, and there's a part A to part B. So in effect is a height limit. Except, am I right in saying that the reason it goes higher because of air rights, that people buy air rights and therefore they could build taller? And if that is true, does that mean there will be less air rights that people will buy, since you can't do anything with it? So it's a three-part question, and I guess any one of them could be a no. But am I right in what I'm saying?
So air rights have nothing to do with height limits. Air rights is the amount of FAR that is available to be built based on the lot size.
So if you don't have height limits, wouldn't that mean you could build higher?
If you don't have height limits and you acquire air rights, you can build to the moon. If you do have height limits, your choices are either make your ceilings shorter, you know, and max out, you know, the envelope, but there becomes a limit as to what you could actually, how many development rights, square footage rights you can actually use.
And just
George, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I could. I would also say that the building envelope is designed to be loose. So you could build taller and skinnier, or you could build shorter and squatter. And so there's a lot of space within the allowable building envelope. That allows for the purchasing of development rights from neighboring lots to fill up that building envelope. So it's not always compressing floor to ceiling heights, but sometimes that does happen. That's not ideal. Typically, you would just expand on one point or another. The other thing I would say is that on the Upper East Side, we have the tower on base uh, building form, which means that you can't actually go to the moon. Tower on base building form keeps you have to have 60% of your floor area under 150 feet, and there's also minimum tower coverages, which essentially limit the form, at least pre-City of Yes, to about 400 feet, roughly. There's some variation on that. And yeah, so it wouldn't be like a midtown super tall, right? You can't do a midtown super tall on a tower on base.
Well, that 59th Street building park is it or something that's up in the
Right.
sky. You're also limited to how narrow you can make it. So I understand. I always explain to people, think of having a quart of orange juice. You could have a short, squat pitcher, or you could have a
Yep.
12
That's right.
fill it up, but there's just a limit to how tall, thin the pitcher is. And the other comment, just to understand what Michelle says, you work extremely hard in getting the right R. And isn't that contextual? Didn't you do that because of a contextual feeling? So
I
I'm
mean,
not
in terms of the zones that we selected?
Yeah, I mean, some are contextual and some are not contextual. There are R10 is not a contextual zoning district. But the R8A, the R10A, and the R8B are contextual zoning districts. The contextual zoning districts have stated height caps. The R10 does not have a stated height cap. The height is controlled by, as George said, the form of the building, the size of the zoning lot, so on and so forth.
But by choosing an R8A or or something else, you're basically saying we want it to be a lower amount to fit in contextually with it.
Correct.
Yes.
What else would contextual be? Would it be the type of bricks you could use? What else would you say if you say you wanted to be? So it's just basically the height, am I right?
Height and also base heights as well, right? There's base height, street walls, base heights.
Okay.
Contextual districts also have lineup provisions. So like if a neighboring building is, at the street line, your building is supposed to be at the street line. If it's set back 5 feet, it's supposed to be set back 5 feet so that all the buildings line up. So there is neighboring buildings are important for the lineup provisions.
Okay. Thank you. I've only been on the board for about 16 years.
Think of Madison Avenue. Madison Avenue has that street wall contiguity. They want that, they require that.
Thank you.
Sebastian?
Thank you. Just going back to the wording of the resolution, I know just before we had some back and forth about are we asking for proposals for more housing and how to consider neighborhood character. I'd like to propose what would hopefully be a friendly amendment just on a simple resolution with the wording that the Community Board 8 supports the recommendations of the Residential Rezoning Task Force and directs the Residential Rezoning Task Force to submit their proposal to the Department of City Planning. Nice and simple, just leave it at that.
Yeah. I can support that, and I think I appreciate everyone's feedback and comments, and I think that's probably a better approach to doing it. So yes, thank you.
Great. Yes, Judy.
Sorry, Mike, can't raise my hand. I don't know why. I'd like to call the question.
Any objection? So I think I have a second from Sharon Pope Marshall. Is anyone opposed to calling the question? Okay. Let us take a vote. for the members of the public, this is now a vote of the members of the community board who are present. So all in favor. And I'm showing, and Adam, maybe you want to do the count. I'm showing myself, Adam, Michelle, Judy, Sebastian, Taina, Sharon, Craig, and Barbara here. Are there any community board members that I've missed? I don't think so. Okay. Can we just do a all in favor? We don't need a roll call. Is there anybody opposed?
Yeah, this is where raise your hand if you're opposed.
Okay, am I correct that this is a unanimous approval?
Correct.
Beautiful. Thank you. And Boaz, thank you for the screen responses throughout the meeting. They've been great to see. Do we have any other old business? Yes, Judy.
Move to adjourn.
Do we have a second? Barbara Rudder. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. And I guess we'll see you all next week at the full board meeting.